Hi everyone, I'm Roshan and welcome to another episode of the Startup Operator. On this episode, I'll be speaking to Rasima Swarup, who is the India Country Manager at BFA Global and the Catalyst Fund. The Catalyst Fund is an accelerator for fintech startups that are building affordable, accessible, and appropriate solutions for underserved communities in emerging markets of India, Africa, and Latin America. We'll be talking to her about impact investing and how they are positively affecting these communities on this podcast. So without further ado, welcome Rasima to the Startup Operator podcast.
Thanks, Roshan. Happy to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Good to have you here as well. So maybe we can begin with a little bit of a context on your background itself. So you've been an engineer and a consultant before this. How did you get started with impact investing?
Sure, it's a great question. One that I've been asked a few times as well. I think it actually comes from, I'll have to rewind a little bit. So I was actually raised in Kenya, and a lot of what I had engaged with or interacted with over there as well was impactful communities, something my family had also ingrained in me or instilled in me as I was growing up as a child, that, there are always think about solutions that are beneficial to those that are underserved. And something on those lines just stayed with me when I grew up as well. When I did graduate from high school, I did my engineering, like you mentioned, in India, in the South. And what I grew to really like about my course, which was in computer science engineering, was how you could create a lot of different kinds of tech solutions with a simple piece of code. And the passion in me was even more, excited or incited as a result of that course as well. And I was, constantly thinking about, hey, how do we actually create a platform that can perhaps, connect various kinds of NGOs so they can, reach other underserved communities. It was my initial set of thinking during my undergrad time. And so when I did graduate, I joined a consulting firm, like you mentioned, and worked within their cyber risk services practice. And I was fortunate enough to have gone through a lot of different areas of work within that organization. So starting with the actual technology design, development, testing, deployment, so the software lifecycle, and then moving on towards the front line of really understanding what user experience means or gathering user information. And ultimately in my head, everything was around what skills can I gather that I could then leverage and pivot to in a more impact-oriented space. So I worked a couple of years in consulting for that very reason that I will, learn more and be able to apply that later. And went to graduate school where I focused on international business, development economics. That passion on how do you really assess impact was still pretty much there. And learning about impact evaluations, what does data-driven impact mean? All of that came through grad school, and that's where I came across BFA Global and Catalyst Fund, and I've pretty much never looked back. What I really liked about Catalyst Fund in general was the fact that we were focusing on these data-driven approaches. This is super impactful work in terms of looking at entrepreneurs that are designing specific solutions for those underserved communities, and we could, ultimately help them grow their product. And it's actually very exciting to see when a startup becomes bigger and then becomes more successful and grows. So that's a little bit about how I got into this space.
So you've always had this grand design at the back of your head, and you've kind of acquired all of these skills very methodically. I'm really envious of you. I mean, so I just stumbled onto one opportunity after another, and here we are, right? So that's fantastic. So let's talk about the work that you do at Catalyst itself. What is your investing thesis and vision? So how do you balance, some of what you talked about, which is impact and making a difference in these communities, with also the business fundamentals and having to return, a multiple to your LPs and other stakeholders?
Right. So actually, Catalyst Fund is a philanthropic program. We don't
Okay.
actually have a stake in the companies that we invest in. So maybe I'll start with what the model for Catalyst Fund is, and then move into the investment thesis. So,
Sure.
so like you mentioned earlier, it is that absolutely an accelerator program and a grant investment vehicle that supports those early stage inclusive fintech startups in emerging markets. We started the program together with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, JP Morgan Chase Foundation, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around 4 years ago, and are now also supported by the UK Department for International Development. The core reason behind Catalyst Fund being developed was that we wanted to solve some very common yet extremely acute problems that early stage founders, especially in emerging markets, face. One is related to accessing that early stage capital. Another is to source local talent and use those skills to develop and iterate on their products for the underserved communities that they're targeting. And then the third is also about forging partnerships to drive their own scale. And currently, there are far too many entrepreneurs that really cannot access that financing, especially at that early stage.
Right.
It can be just because they're too small, or they're too risky, or they're profit constrained. Investors want to see more growth, and that's where they face this chicken and egg problem where they need the capital to show traction, but they need to show traction to get capital. And so that's where we actually come in. And the model is simple. We provide them with catalytic grant capital early on, zero stake involved here. This is something that the founders can use at their own discretion, autonomously. And then we couple that with very tailored, very bespoke venture building support. And finally, also work on curated connections with investors and corporate innovators. So that's how the model works. Totally philanthropic. And I think, coming to your question about the investment thesis itself. So our investment thesis is, it really revolves around the fact that world over today, there's still about 3 billion people that are currently underserved by the global financial system. And that has very negative repercussions on their own livelihoods. And our core belief and focus on the power of fintech being a force of good to solve this problem is where we look at accelerating or supporting founders that are creating those solutions for the underserved, those 3 billion underserved. So we basically back entrepreneurs that are pushing the boundaries in financial services innovations related to, say, savings or insurance or credit or payments. Think about financial advisory, access to essential goods and services, and a lot more. But that's a little bit in a nutshell. I could go a little bit deeper, which is over this time frame. So in a nutshell, it's various fintech products, be it any particular financial service, as it relates to serving those underserved communities. But over this time frame, we've also seen how fintech innovation has actually evolved with the help of new and upcoming technologies. So if you think about mobile money, or you think about agent or branchless banking, and then you couple it with potentially some kind of machine learning solutions that can really make it cheaper and easier to deliver financial services to these poor or underserved communities, then we're seeing, better ways of reaching these folks as well. And through this time, we've also noticed that a lot of solutions are being embedded into different sectors. So think about healthcare or education, think about agriculture, e-commerce, retail, you name it. There's a need to embed finance and financial services within these sectors so that the end customers, the underserved customers, are able to feel more resilient and can access those very necessary requirements, be it education, healthcare, and whatnot. So over time, just to close it out, I guess, what we've seen is 3 large areas of opportunity that inform our investment thesis. One is improving financial health for these end customers, making them more resilient. Another is enabling access to essential services like water and electricity. And then the third is really leveraging platforms as levers for more inclusive economies, platforms that can provide, appropriate financial services and also benefits to gig workers, just as an example.
Right. So how much of an advantage do you think the way your fund is structured is for the kind of work that you do?
Well, we think that the fund structure is catered, or it's structured in such a way that it focuses primarily on the benefit and acceleration of that startup. And so when we think about, initial funding so they could grow and be able to sustain themselves enough to get to product market fit, that is part of our model. The fact that they need guidance, they need talent and skills that they may either not find in the market or they couldn't afford in the market, depending on the type of skill, is something that we offer through the venture building aspect. And then the final piece, which is where they need those opportunities to grow and scale, is where we connect them with those investors and the corporates. So what we have seen over the time frame that we have supported startups is that we've actually, over this time, supported about 31 startups across 14 emerging markets. And they have together reached millions of customers and raised over $77 million in follow-on funding. So we have seen a lot of benefit in terms of the model as it stands, and how it benefits the startups.
Okay, actually that lends itself to the next question I was going to ask, which is, how do you measure impact on these investments?
That's a great question. Catalyst Fund is actually a very data-driven, heavily impact-oriented program. And so when we think about measuring impact, we measure it at various levels of the program. When it comes to the startup, we actually look at business performance and metrics. We look at their sustainability, what kind of runway we can help provide or lengthen for them. We look at their other business performance metrics, how fintech can actually help reduce acquisition costs and the like, which we help improve through our venture building support. We also look at customer impact metrics which can be very different based on the type of business model we're supporting. And ultimately, we've also got we collaborate with other organizations like 60 Decibels and The Mix, which is now developing an innovation hub for data and impactful data for early stage startups. All of which then go into understanding the impact that this startup has actually made on the end customer as well. So we've gone all the way from the business performance to the business's perspective of impact to the actual customer impact. And then from a Catalyst Fund, from a program standpoint, we look at a few metrics ourselves as well. We look at how many customers our startups have collectively reached, what sort of performance and follow-on funding we've managed to help them with. So how many connections have we really facilitated that have reached or helped benefit these startups, and mutually on the other side, the investors or corporate innovators. We also look at the return on total invested, which is basically a metric for accelerators where for every $1 that you invest in a startup, how many dollars has the startup managed to raise as a result? Okay. So these are some specific metrics and how we think about impact.
Okay. Really sorry for the interruption. I'm just going to take a minute of your time to talk to you about something amazing. Move fast, break things. All of that is great advice for when you have nothing to lose. But once you have some base of users and customers, you cannot really afford to risk quality. So how do you still ship at lightning pace and delight your users and customers at the same time? Now that's where Bagasura comes in. Bagasura is a super easy way for people to give and take feedback about the product, and most importantly, close the loop. If you work in a design team, you know screenshots suck. But with Bagasura, you can actually get people to give you very contextual and accurate feedback about your UI and your UX. If you work in a QA team, you know 90% of your time goes in reproducing bugs. But with Bagasura, you can get people to reproduce bugs, document test cases, and resolve things all within Jira itself. Bagasura is being used by some of the leading design and QA teams around, and it's brought to you by the good folks at Mulia Testing, which is one of the best software and QA firms in the world. Do check out bagasura.io, that's BUGASURA.io, and sign up for a demo today. Ship fast and ship well. So some of the things that you mentioned, right? Fintech in emerging markets, for example, is a greenfield of opportunities, right? Whether it's financial inclusion, access to credit, and so on. Within that, what are some of the opportunities that you're really excited by?
Yeah, so I think to my previous point, I think one of the bigger opportunities, something that we're really excited about is the opportunity of embedded finance and how we can think about improving financial health through embedded finance. So if we think about, say, digital platforms, or we think, let's start with digital platforms, right? So think about e-commerce or any platform that can connect various members on a supply chain or the value chain. How you could perhaps even leverage the data that's being collected by this platform such that you can create financial services for the micro entrepreneurs or the small entrepreneurs that are part of the platform too. Financial services could be credit, it could be insurance, it could be savings, or other such ideas, depending on what you can reasonably offer in the context of the merchant or the stakeholder. But on the flip side, there's also fintech solutions potentially offering these financial services to platforms or through platforms. And maybe this is one area where I should add an example. So let's think about a digital gig worker. These are digital communities, digital first communities. They leverage digital platforms for work opportunities. And we have currently a company in our current cohort called Karma Life, which basically is an Indian startup that is developing financial resilience products for these blue-collar digital gig economy workers. And they're doing this starting out by offering instant payments and instant credit solutions through digital platforms. So they're working with platforms of the likes of Uber and of Zomato, and collaborating with the platforms to generate the right kind of work data, and gather more data from the gig workers as well to reach the gig workers. So having a good, standard, stable channel to offer services to these gig workers. On the digital platform side that I'd mentioned earlier, we've got some interesting examples there as well. One of the companies that we've supported in the past is called SocoWatch, which is based in East Africa. It's a B2B e-commerce company that connects merchants with large supply chain providers, or suppliers rather, in the supply chain. And through the transactions and through their connections, they've been able to offer very customized solutions to these merchants directly as well, not necessarily leveraging any kind of partnership with other digital platforms. So they've become the platform themselves, basically. Beyond, I guess, embedded finance solutions, which we think are a really exciting opportunity, we also think that in the financial inclusion space, the inclusive fintech space, we're beginning to see more innovation in insurtech models. Right. Unfortunately, India is still pretty low in its penetration, and we would love to see more of the models we're seeing in Africa or Latin America coming into India as well. But beyond, for example, the traditional insurance products, we see the traditional life and health insurance products, we're beginning to see mobile-based insurance offerings, or we're beginning to see hospital cash coverage, which is specifically for, say, COVID in this time, so that people are covered when they need to get to the hospital. So there are a few, that's areas within insurance as well. I'm thinking, yeah, I think those are the ones that come to mind.
Right. So some of the ideas that you mentioned, right, they also require these startups to sort of interplay with partner ecosystems, right? So whether it's banks or insurance carriers or regulators or hospitals, what have you, do you also help the founders build relationships with these partners as well?
We do wherever we can, yes. So some of the startups, when they join the Catalyst Fund program, they are either already in active conversations with these corporate innovators, be it the banks or the insurance providers or whoever else they're talking to, and so sometimes through our venture building support, we're actually helping them strengthen their pilot, streamline the pilot, make sure that the pilot is successful. In other cases, the companies come in and they're looking at this model and they want to start testing it with various corporate innovators, and that's where then we help them identify various corporate innovators that they could begin to test the product with, and help them along the journey as well in terms of designing what that might look like and how it could even potentially scale up down the line.
Right. And operating in these markets, I'm sure it would have their own set of challenges as well, like dealing with regulation, or in some cases you're creating categories by themselves, right? I mean, you're creating categories itself, and these solutions may be pioneering, and customers may not really have a sort of a precedence to some of these solutions. What are some of the challenges that you notice in building for this particular market as such?
Mm-hmm. So I think when we For starters, you're absolutely right. Depending on the type of solution and the country that you're in, there's a big chance that maybe the country's regulatory policies or environment is not as enabling as yet for the particular startup. So what we try to do for starters is work with the startup to understand where there may be a regulatory hiccup. In a lot of cases, when you start early, there are ways for the startup to position its product in such a way that it falls within the regulatory sandboxes or the environment within the country. But eventually, as they grow and scale, there is the need to connect with regulators as well and to have those conversations. We personally, at this early stage, have seen some challenges with regulators, perhaps with one or two companies in East Africa, where they had to basically wait for a while for the regulation to be, I guess, tweaked in such a way that they could continue to work on a blockchain solution that they were working on at the time. But it hasn't actually been such a big hurdle, regulation, from what we've seen. What we have seen beyond, like the bigger challenges that early stage startups have seen, is in finding talent beyond the purview of Catalyst Fund. So once they graduate from the program, how do they continue to work with the same kind of skills and expertise? Who do they hire? Where do they hire from? Or even with corporate innovators, are they at a place where they can continue to roll up or scale up their POCs? So I think there we've seen more challenges than the regulation aspect itself.
Right. Yeah, and one could argue that regulation in emerging markets, in some respects, are probably more forward-thinking or innovative than the mature markets themselves. I mean, if you were to compare, let's say, payments in India versus payments in the US, right? There's a night and day difference. Whether it's paying cashless or peer-to-peer, so on and so forth, right? So the other thing I wanted to ask you was, you've worked in these markets. Is there a specific guideline that you've evolved as a business model? I mean, so if there's an entrepreneur listening to this, or if it's a wannabe entrepreneur who has a couple of ideas, who's listening, what are 2 or 3 principles that you would suggest to this person on building for these markets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually something we work on daily. One aspect of Catalyst Fund, just a side note, is that being a philanthropic program, we have a pretty heavy learning mandate. One where we have key questions that we want to answer. We want to share with the industry so that investors, startups, other corporates can learn more about innovation and fintech in these emerging markets and learn about how they can navigate the environments as well. So this particular question is something we're always thinking about in terms of how best to even disseminate the learnings that we have. I think for startups that are that have ideas, that are thinking about these particular markets, the first piece that we always look at is how well do you understand your customer? And oftentimes there are quite a few, it's surprising, but oftentimes quite a few people come up with assumptions. Quite a few founders assume that, I have interacted with 2 or 3 merchants that were, in my residential area, and I understand them because of what they've told me. Or I've been on these Uber rides and I've interacted with these drivers and I understand, some of the pain points, and here's a great solution. But it is really about delving a little bit deeper into understanding at a larger level what the jobs are, the pains are, the gains are of the target segment you're you're focusing on, and how really does your value proposition address those jobs, those pains, those gains. So one of the frameworks that we do encourage startups to look at is the jobs, pains, gains, and the value proposition. This that initially started out by Strategizer, if you in case you've seen it or not so sure, but in addition to looking at the customers as well, the other piece is really about not trying to develop your product from the get-go and thinking that, we've now validated and we understand that this is the product and now we're going to build it out completely, but rather go through an iterative experimental approach where you are still constantly working alongside these customers. I think one thing that we've seen quite frequently is that a lot of founders tend to be in the bigger cities. And if they want to develop, say, solutions for tier 2 cities or more rural populations, sometimes in the mindset, they don't realize how much tech-oriented the solution should be versus touch-oriented the solution should be. So, and by touch, I mean how much guidance and support and other awareness and messaging the end customer might need to be onboarded. So I would probably just add finally that they should always, while they're iterating and experimenting, always keep the feedback loop open with their end customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. One is building with a stakeholder community, right? Because it's not as simple as shipping an app and then, sort of watching it soar in some sense. I mean, you really have to replicate that end user delight. And in these cases, I mean, it's a very real use case, right? I mean, it could be somebody's access for loans, or I mean, it could be healthcare or whatever it is. The other aspect is also the fact that, social entrepreneurship or whatever, it's driven a lot by the heart. And building a business on fundamentals, if you're building a for-profit, it still has to turn over a buck at the end of the day. So that is something as well that I've kind of noticed. Yeah, wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think often we have seen where startups, they get very passionate about the solution that they've got. And ultimately, it does need to come down to some kind of unit economics that makes sense for you to be able to build that product and scale that product. Absolutely agree with you. Mm-hmm.
Right. So the other thing that I'm curious of is, tech is solving some of the hardest problems in the world, whether it's sustainability or poverty or access. And at the same time, the average entrepreneur is also developing solutions for social media or SaaS or any of those things which are important, but they're second order in terms of impact, right? I mean, how would you urge entrepreneurs to consider the really hard problems like, poverty or healthcare or, access as some of the ones that you invest in? So why should an average Joe entrepreneur solve those problems?
That's a that's $1 million question. Well, for starters, I think there's startups. I keep saying investors. Sorry about that. I think startups or founders in this case really need to find a particular problem that they're solving, and when it comes to the underserved communities, I think oftentimes people feel it's too hard, or it's actually I won't be able to make money here, but that's really not the case. And our metrics can, as well as other accelerator programs, their metrics can show. I think the crux or the trick is to really think about how you can scale your product without it being a very expensive approach. And what we've seen is that you can do that. You can scale, and if you do, that basically means that you've hit a much larger market size in any market, so to say, because the base of the population is generally a lot larger in proportion in any of the markets. So think about India just as an example. In India, we have a small proportion of high-paying, affluent people. We have, based on the most recent statistics, around 80% of the population has a bank account, which is great. Around less than half of them actually use their bank accounts, and that usage is definitely increasing. But it also shows you the opportunity that lies in supporting these particular communities. And the remaining 20% actually amount to roughly 190 million people, which, if you wanted some context, is actually 3 East African countries put together in India itself.
Yeah.
So volume exists. The problem is just different. It's the problem of how do you reach scale with this volume at a low cost, versus, I guess, with the larger or on the flip side, looking at going upstream, you're actually competing with a lot of different products, while what you could do is leverage existing models and go downstream and reach these other less served, less competitive areas as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic point. So this demographic is underserved, and also, I mean, has the volumes to kind of justify those big numbers, right? So one aspect of your work also is the fact that your team is spread out across continents, and in some sense, you've been remote before all of us have been, right? And you have some experience working in that mode of work. So what does it feel like to work remotely with a diverse team, and any pointers for the rest of us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. We've given how global the team is, we've been working remotely has now become almost second nature to us, and I think it becomes pretty easy to schedule when you start thinking about various kinds of time zones. Must say that it does get difficult initially when you're not used to, I guess, the flexibility. But I think overall, there are a lot of different kinds of tools and collaboration mechanisms that keep the tempo going. On the Catalyst Fund team side, like just us and not with support to entrepreneurs, we use all sorts of tools amongst each other as well, like all sorts of collaboration tools, be it for video conferencing, be it for brainstorming or whiteboarding, or even instant messaging. We're very extremely avid users of Slack, as an example. And we absolutely love Miro to bits. Like whiteboarding and brainstorming there is really good. And we can still ideate without actually being in person. What we did see as a result of the limited travel during this particular time was a limited face-to-face time with our startups and our founders. I think our model did still involve a fair amount of travel or inter-country travel as well, where we brought on specialists from BFA Global in other countries to come support the startup on specific topics and areas. But we also fairly quickly changed that around, using all the tools and mechanisms, Zoom, for example, with the founders too. So one of the things we started doing was focusing firstly on the founders' local time zones and their schedules, to make sure that it works for them and they're fresh. And the other thing we realized was that when you're there in person, you can have these intensive day-long brainstorming sessions and sprints. But online, it's actually a lot easier and a lot more effective to actually break that down into a few hours per day. So make
Zoom
make it
fatigue is a real thing, right?
absolutely. So having like 3 to 4 hours of one sprint is actually not effective or efficient. Instead, break it down into 2 hour chunks on one day, and then debrief on your own, and then the following day do another short sprint. So we have seen a lot of value coming out of that, and founders have found that interesting. So that would definitely be one small tip. Don't try and imitate what you could do in one day in person over Zoom.
Yeah, I think it's a different style of work, and I think we're all kind of adapting. I feel so much so that I mean, if you, it's debatable right now what is normal, right? I mean, so if I were to go back to 5 days in the office, I think I'd feel a little weird for a while. So,
Yeah.
so so the other thing is that I mean, we're operating in exceptional times. Arguably, your startups now are more relevant in the times of COVID than earlier, right? So how do you see that impact playing out?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have certainly seen a surge in the need, of course, for startup solutions that we've been supporting. I think we've seen two things happen. Some startups have had to evolve their approach to actually become more remote and yet be able to offer these services. Ultimately, you have to remember that the underserved communities we're talking about are not as digitally savvy, and they generally need a little more support and handholding, depending on the type of solution, of course. And similarly, for some businesses or organizations, think about MFIs that are rural and focus on rural populations. They may not be as digitally transformed as a financial service provider in a big city. So some startups have had to modify their approach to support their end customers and their end clients. One of our companies, which basically offers software solutions to the likes of the MFIs that I was mentioning, had to break down their core product into smaller modules that the MFIs could digest faster remotely, and start using those immediately to support their end customers remotely too, and use that as a stepping stone to other modules that they could more easily use and consume. Thank you very much. And so we've seen some of these evolutions. Another that we saw was where startups were initially looking at going through various businesses or various channels to reach the end customers. And they've converted or transformed those into direct-to-consumer models because of the challenges in supply chain that they started seeing, which has definitely helped make sure that the connect with the farmer communities or the fishing communities or other such communities remained, and they could continue to be sustainable. On the other side, we've actually seen the actual model of a startup working so well that they could transform, or they could actually grow their services and support governments. So an example here is SocoWatch that I had referred to earlier. They basically now have a network of thousands of micro merchants that cater to the local needs of these low-income populations in various rural communities in East Africa as well, or tier 2 city communities as well. What they refer to as the peri-urban areas. And what SocoWatch did was that they piloted this program with the government there, where they worked with an NGO that identified beneficiaries that would get food and other supplies from the government. They're eligible because of them being low income. These beneficiaries would get a code on their phone and would go to the nearest SocoWatch merchant. The merchant would scan the code and provide the beneficiary with the kinds of grains or rice or lentils or whatever they were allotted for. And once the code was scanned, the merchant actually got paid for the product that was given to the beneficiary. So as a result of SocoWatch creating these networks of merchants, this network could actually get leveraged for social safety net purposes as well within the country. So we've seen a lot of promise from that. The pilot was so successful, they're looking at growing it out now. And yeah, there are other such, I guess, product evolution areas that we've also seen, more in insurance as well, which grew really big for insurance specifically for COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, so these are some pretty remarkable changes actually, and I think, I mean, if anything, it accelerates your product, and it accelerates your business, many years forward. I think because some of these trends, whether it was digital or whatever, was already in play, and COVID has sort of acted like a forcing function for these things, right? So. All right. So before I let you go, I have to ask you about some of the books or podcasts that you would recommend. What are some things that we should be reading and listening to?
Ooh, there's a big list. Well, I would actually go, for starters, within the fintech space, I would look at Axion Venture Labs publications. Literally all of them. Okay. I think they come up with great frameworks. They come up with great toolkits that startups can look at. They also have a podcast called VentureCast, which is great to listen to. There are also more local, I guess, podcasts, which an example being The Flip Africa, which does focus on innovation in Africa. But what I've learned from my time at Catalyst Fund, cross-market learning is extremely useful to even contextualize your own products and ideas locally. And so that's a podcast I would suggest. Bank on It is also another really nice one that talks about all things innovation, I guess. On the reading front, I will have to think about it beyond, let's see.
I thought you'll have a whole stack of developmental economics stuff to suggest for us.
Oh, well, they are definite. I can recommend authors. The problem with my memory is that I forget the names of the books. I remember the authors. But if you were interested more specifically in development economics, then the authors or the studies from Jenny Aker are great. Julie Schaffner is another brilliant author who talks very specifically about development policies and impact evaluations there. Mm-hmm. Another great, actually someone who recently released a book on the financial diaries and the lives of gig workers in Kenya. Her name is Julie Zolman, and she's a great, her insights and her research are also really great in terms of understanding the end customer and how you could even design various products there. I do still need to actually think about the books. I have a whole stack, I promise you.
Yeah, maybe, we'll link it to the description in the podcast. So that's a fantastic note to end the podcast on. If there are people listening who would like to get in touch with you, how can they reach you?
Well, they can reach out to me on my email that I can share, and I'm available on LinkedIn as well. And those are actually the two best ways, I guess, to reach me.
Not a Twitter person?
I'm still learning. Yes, my social media skills are a work in progress. And the best I've gotten to is LinkedIn.
That's actually a good thing. That's actually a good thing, I'd say. So all right. I mean, this was super fun, and thanks so much for your time. I'd love to do a follow up sometime, and maybe we could have some of those startups that you've invested in on the show as well. I'd love to talk about the impact that they're causing in these communities. Right.
Absolutely.
Thanks everyone. Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. The podcast will be available on all popular platforms. Until next time, stay safe and take care.